This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele has dramatically reduced crime in El Salvador in recent years, but at the cost of civil liberties. What do two recent arrests of opposition figures tell us about the future of one of Latin America's best-known leaders?
So there is a sense that there's a reassessment of the benefits and the downsides of President Bukele and what he's doing in the country. It will take time to see whether he regains his footing and goes back to how it was, or whether this is really something we look back at as a turning point in his rule of El Salvador and the country itself.
President Nayib Bukele continues to be one of the world's most popular leaders, but two recent high-profile arrests have raised the question of whether he is cracking down even further on the political opposition and civil society in El Salvador. Ruth López, a prominent attorney critical of Bukele and the head of an anti-corruption unit at the human rights NGO Cristo Sal, was arrested in May, accused of embezzling state funds. Then, Enrique Anaya, a constitutional lawyer who has called Bukele a dictator, was also arrested recently on charges of money laundering. El Salvadoran officials say the charges are supported by evidence, but some other observers see an even further deterioration of El Salvador's democracy and wonder if the country is on a path to joining Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba as clear-cut examples of dictatorships in the Americas. President Bukele said last week, and I quote, "I don't care if they call me a dictator. I'd rather be called a dictator than see Salvadorans killed in the streets," end quote. This alleged crackdown comes at an interesting time when President Bukele appears a little more vulnerable than he did a few years ago. The economy surpassed security recently as Salvadorans' biggest concern in polls. And the record there is mixed. The cost of living is rising, and the poverty rate increased from about 27% in 2019 to more than 30% in 2023. GDP grew only 2.6% last year, and the country signed an IMF deal in February to shore up its government accounts. When Bukele met with business leaders from across Latin America in February to encourage investment, he said he was hoping that an economic miracle in the country would eclipse the security miracle. Add all these things up, and there has been a small dip, at least, in President Bukele's approval rating. A Sid Gallup poll showed approval dropping from 89% in 2024 to 85% in 2025. Obviously, that is still very high. Anyway, we thought it was an interesting time to look broadly at El Salvador's politics and economy. Our guest is Sarah Birke. She is the bureau chief for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean at The Economist. She recently visited El Salvador and wrote an article that earned plenty of attention. Sarah, welcome to the America's Quarterly Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Sarah, you were recently in El Salvador. You wrote an article for The Economist about your visit. What was your overall impression of the political atmosphere there?
Well, it's changed. I mean, I go quite frequently to El Salvador, and really there was much more of a sense of fear on the ground this time. I think people felt like the rules of the game were changing and they didn't quite know where they stood, and there was quite a lot of fear. So it felt quite different this time.
I assume that a lot of that had to do with the arrest of activists and opposition figures such as Ruth López, who I mentioned in the introduction, Enrique Anaya as well. First of all, do you agree with the view that these cases are politically motivated? And what is the reason for this, these arrests?
Yeah, so I actually arrived 2 days after Ruth's arrest, and that really for me was the signal that I should get on a plane and go to the country. And I do think it's changing. I think it's showing a willingness on Bukele's part to act more openly against critics, and without the excuse of the security regime that he's created over the past 3 years now. It seems fairly obvious to me that it is politically motivated. And the sense of why he's doing it now is it seems like from January, there's been the kind of number of hits to his image and popularity, things that haven't gone super well for him. So to start with, he turned over a ban on mining, which was incredibly unpopular. Then there was the collapse of an infrastructure project, which caused huge tailbacks and queues in El Salvador. And then El Faro in May revealed the sort of extent of negotiations between Bukele and the gang. And so there's this sense that, Bukele has tried to regain a sense of popularity and control of the narrative, the usual things in terms of handouts, and hasn't quite managed. And so instead of trying to use these sweeteners, he's reverted a bit more to the stick.
This idea or these accusations that President Bukele is persecuting his political opponents, that he is chipping away at democratic institutions, this is not a new idea. There was, certainly the impression from the outside looking in that for his first 4+ years in power, that the progress that he was making on security kind of overcame whatever objections everyday Salvadorans might have had on these other issues. Is that no longer the case?
I mean, I think we're at a tipping point where we'll see if that's still the case. A couple of people I spoke to specifically said that. They sort of said, up until now, what he's been doing, the price has been worth what we've got back. But now there was some sense, and, we're talking around a small number potentially of Salvadorans, not everyone by any means, Bukele remains popular, that maybe the equation is changing, that maybe now the costs are creeping up and the benefit is still there. El Salvador is still very safe. But, people have also got somewhat used to that now, and they're looking at what next? What else is he going to provide for us? So there is a sense that there's a reassessment of the benefits and the downsides of President Bukele and what he's doing in the country. It will take time to see whether he regains his footing and goes back to how it was, or whether this is really something we look back at as a turning point in his rule of El Salvador and the country itself.
Do we risk overstating this turn, though? I mean, he's still, as you said, quite popular. I mean, I've seen polling showing that his popularity dropped, according to Gallup, from 89% in 2024 to 85% in 2025. Is there any other polling you've seen that might paint a different picture? Or are we talking about a relatively, small slice of civil society and journalists and others who are quite bothered by what he's doing on the institutional front?
Yeah, so I think there's several points there. So I think, one, it probably is a relatively small slice of the population that are worried about it, although I think in the long run, this is potentially going to affect everyone. But there is a couple of things to be said on the polling. I mean, first of all, there are always questions about the accuracy of polling, but especially in El Salvador, where 80% of the population a couple of years ago, or maybe it was a year ago, told one pollster that they were scared of saying their true opinion. Now, by no means am I trying to say that Bukele does not remain incredibly popular, because I think he does. But I think there is a question about that polling. I've also seen some private polling or other polls that suggest that there is a slide, and it is a modest slide. I think what we need to wait and see is whether this slide continues or whether it's a small dip and then he comes back up again. I mean, a couple of analysts I spoke to when I was there said what they've noticed in terms of dips in polling, that we've seen them before, odd small dips, but they've been linked often to spikes in prices. And this one isn't linked to that. And they wonder if this is the start of a more gradual decline than a just sort of little dip and then it bounces back up again. So I think there is a question. It's not a foregone conclusion what's going to happen. We have to wait and see over the coming weeks.
Sarah, this scenario that you're sketching out does raise the question of whether there is any kind of opposition in El Salvador that might be able to, benefit, at least gain some traction. Do you see any possibility for that?
No, I don't. There isn't much opposition to talk of. If you're talking about political opposition, 3 of 60 MPs in the National Assembly are non-nuevas ideas or allies. And that's partly been achieved by changing boundaries and municipalities and reducing the number of them. I mean, he's making it a very difficult playing field for a political opposition to grow. And then if you're talking about NGOs or civil society or journalists, which is just what we've been talking about, it's really a case of trying to strangle them and squish them and stop them playing any role and trying to discredit them. And we've seen that. And I think we're seeing that with the fact they're bringing corruption charges against people like Ruth. Previous governments in El Salvador were considered incredibly corrupt. So trying to smear people with this corruption image is quite a smart thing to do. It's one of those things that might gain traction because people do believe that most people are corrupt or anyone associated with the former governments were corrupt. So I think it's hard to see this as a chance for the opposition to suddenly grow or have success.
Sarah, beyond a potential decline in public opinion, are there any other risks to President Bukele from these arrests? I mean, I guess the question is there any countervailing power at this point that might step in? I doubt it. The opinion seems to have crystallized about him already in the international sphere. I mean, he has many supporters around Latin America, many critics in Europe, a mix, I suppose, in the United States. I mean, is there any downside from his perspective to, as you see it, rounding up his critics and putting them in jail?
I mean, I think there's a downside in that he cares about his image perhaps more than any other president we've ever seen or I can think of globally, right? I mean, he really wanted to come across as cool and tech savvy and a reformer, and not in that kind of classic autocratic way that we, when we think of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, for example. So I think there is a downside. In terms of, and obviously you might get a change of public opinion, at least when there is a change of power, if there is a change of power in the US at some point when Donald Trump ends his term, although that's a way off.
We've got a ways to go.
We've got a way to go, yeah. But so I think there is a downside to him. But at the same time, in some ways, it doesn't matter because he has all the levers of power, controls everything in that state. So it's not like he's going to get voted out in a democratic election, or it's not like, there's going to be a coup because he has the full loyalty of the army. So in that sense, he can probably ride it out. But I do think he probably deeply cares about how he's perceived both at home and abroad.
I want to ask you a philosophical question. You wrote in your piece for The Economist, you said, echoing a bit what you've just said here, you said Mr. Bukele's carefully crafted image as a young, innovative, can-do reformer, all baseball caps and Bitcoin, is wearing away to reveal just another thin-skinned Latin American dictator. Do you really think he's a dictator at this point? And I ask this because, this is someone who won an election by a big margin in 2024. Elements, the state of siege, for example, that he's been governing under has been renewed by Congress. I mean, does he really meet the same standard as at this point as a Nicolas Maduro, a Daniel Ortega, or the dictatorship in Cuba?
I mean, I think there's a scale, right? You can see this road where you're ticking off various things that happen on the way to becoming a dictator, and people can decide at what point they think those criteria are fulfilled. But, we're seeing many of the same steps being taken by him. He remains far more popular, and I think that does matter, than other leaders who you've just mentioned. If you look at some of the things that are happening, they are things that we saw in Nicaragua or we've seen in other countries that now are what you might call a fully fledged dictatorship. The bringing in of the law that controls NGOs and anyone who receives funds from abroad, for example, it's very similar to the one in Nicaragua and one in Russia as well. And so I think there's almost it's a semantic question of, okay, at what point do you name him a dictator? And that is probably something that depends personally. But the sort of characteristics of a dictatorship are there and are developing. And again, I think it's not like he's as far down the road as Daniel Ortega yet, although he's been in power far less time. But, it's step by step. It looks like we're heading that direction.
I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit about the economy, which you've mentioned already. But in 2023, it did surpass security in polls as the biggest concern of everyday Salvadorans. The cost of living is going up. The poverty rate increased from 27% in 2019 to about 30% in 2023. What is happening in the Salvadoran economy that explains some of these trends?
Well, again, I think it's a glass half full, glass half empty. I mean, in some ways, Bukele has done good things for the economy. I think it was expected, or there's a sense of optimism about it because of the security situation now being so much better. There was also very clearly a commitment to pay debts and lessen the fiscal deficit, which helped lead to the IMF deal that was concluded earlier this year, and also obviously putting Bitcoin to one side. But it's still not growing particularly fast. I mean, if you look at the IMF's projections for this year, Honduras and Guatemala look like they're going to grow faster than El Salvador, which is pretty stunning, frankly. And I think the other sense, and again, this came across very strongly when I was there last month, is that the model of development is very flashy. It looks very nice. You know, you've got the likes of Google coming in, but people say it's not necessarily creating opportunities for those lower down in sort of for run-of-the-mill jobs. And there's really a sense that the cost of living is just sort of extremely high and very difficult for people. So it really overall feels like a sense of very uneven economic development. And I think this is the other concern in terms of this crackdown on critics, is what effect that's going to have on the economy. I mean, business people, when I were there, were incredibly reluctant to talk. They did not want to speak at all. But the couple of people who I managed to talk to said, you know, this has put us on tenterhooks. We're like watching. And, you know, that's not to say that business can't thrive in a dictatorship. We see that happening in other places, but there is a concern about it.
Wait, so if I understand correctly, people were even hesitant to speak to you on an off-record basis.
Yeah. So, I mean, business people, yeah, even on completely off record. Yeah.
Wow, because they thought that somehow what they said, or just the fact that they met with you, would be used against them.
I guess so. I mean, the business community has always been slightly more closed there, but yeah, they really thought there would be repercussions for them and their businesses. So, I mean, the other point I was going to make is that corruption is a growing theme as well, right? So there's this sense that Bukele and his family is profiting from their control of the state. And I think that's something as well which plays into the sense that the economy is not a level playing field, and that it's not necessarily just sort of a free market and things are going to be decided in a fair way. I mean, there is this sense that it's now an economy that's going to benefit potentially cronies of Bukele. And when I say that sense, that's more among the business community and international observers, not, again, among the general population.
What is the final verdict on President Bukele's grand experiment with Bitcoin?
I mean, again, it really depends who you talk to, right? I mean, some people think it's wonderful and it was wonderful and the IMF are trying to curb it. And other people think it was a disaster. And isn't it great that the IMF have made Bukele curb it in order to get this deal? I think overall, it's a flop if you take the terms that Bukele framed it in, right? So when he brought it about, it was, I think, partly an image thing, but it was also, in theory, on paper, he said to provide financial services to adults who didn't have a bank account, and also to lower the cost of remittances, which obviously is a huge thing in El Salvador. But, you know, both of those things didn't prove to be things that Bitcoin could help with. You know, financial inclusion, people didn't have the financial literacy to use Bitcoin. They saw it as far too volatile as something to get into. And lots of Salvadorans send remittances in cash because, again, they don't necessarily trust Bitcoin. It fluctuates in price, or they don't necessarily trust any form of electronic banking. So on neither of those grounds did it actually do anything. It was more of a sort of thing that was popular among a very small group of people, often Americans, who sort of came down and tweeted and Instagrammed about how wonderful it was that they could pay with Bitcoin at the beach.
Shifting a bit to take back up the subject of security again, you know, we have seen this recent U.S. indictment, which claimed that gangs agreed to reduce murders and hide bodies in some cases. We also had a recent interview conducted by El Faro, the Salvadoran outlet, which they spoke to a gang leader who gave details of alleged deals in which gangs, you know, rounded up votes for Bukele and his party in their neighborhoods, and that there were deals to suppress the murder rate and enforce curfews. As a result, President Bukele has denied any wrongdoing in these cases. Again, this same question, I mean, have these accusations found any traction with the general public, or are they mostly limited to a small set of people who are worried about democratic integrity.
I mean, I think that one has had more resonance in among the general population. And again, it might not still be a majority. I mean, if you look at the number of times the El Faro videos, they were video interviews with two gang leaders, have been watched, they far outstrip the normal number of views that El Faro has. So in that sense, they do seem to have circulated widely. Now, some people you talk to say, well, we don't really care how he sorted out the security situation. As long as it stays this way, whatever. And then you talk to other people who worry that, you shouldn't talk to gang leaders. This is just yet another sign of Bukele and the way he operates and the fact that he is very untransparent about things. But also that it might mean that the security situation, how he's cleaned it up is not what he says it is. And therefore, there are even more doubts about whether it's sustainable in the medium and long run. So I think, again, it's not necessarily found traction among the majority of the population, but it is something that people are talking about for sure.
You said, Sarah, that you travel pretty frequently to El Salvador. It definitely feels so much safer than it used to. Is there any sign or any suggestion that incredible progress that country has made might be reversed, or any sort of fragility around that? Or does it feel kind of consolidated at this point?
It feels consolidated. I mean, all the people who talk about this not being sustainable in the long run, and it might not be, but it's very theoretical at this stage. It feels incredibly safe. You can walk around pretty much any neighborhood you like. I went out to do some meetings far outside of the city at 7, 8, 9 p.m. of night. And, those are things you could never have done before. So in that sense, it still does feel very, very consolidated.
Let's talk a little bit about his relationship with President Trump. There's been a lot of commentary around this, a lot of, the images of Bukele there in the Oval Office. Is there anything about that relationship that most people might not appreciate?
I think perhaps the thing that's not necessarily appreciated is that I'm not quite sure what Bukele is getting, or rather what El Salvador is getting out of this. I mean, obviously there's some cash for having the prisoners, but it doesn't seem like El Salvador is getting any pass on anything. The tax on remittances, which is part of the big, beautiful bill, applies to El Salvador just as it does to other places. It's not like Salvadorans aren't being rounded up and deported from the US either. I mean, there's definitely a sense, again, among critics in El Salvador, that Bukele is more interested in what he personally can get. So this sense that he potentially wants the US to extradite some Salvadoran gang leaders so that they can't talk or testify in US courts about his negotiations with them. So I think maybe that's the part of the relationship that's not fully understood and that we still don't understand is, what is Bukele getting from this? What does he want from this? What does he expect from this? Or is it that he just likes the sort of sense of being admired that he clearly gets from Trump and the MAGA crew?
I suppose it's, basking in the glow of the approval of a fairly popular president of the United States.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think both of these people care deeply about their image, and they have this mutual sense that they're succeeding, that they're popular, that, things are going well for them, and they can enjoy basking in it together.
Did you get any sense, Sarah, for how everyday Salvadorans feel about being, sort of a prison facility for deportees from the United States?
I mean, again, that was kind of interesting because you found a lot of mixed opinions. Some people seemed to quite like it. Some people said they thought it was fine, but, people should have rights and they didn't think they had the rights to appeal against being put in this jail. And then there were some people who really didn't like it, who thought this was a bad look, that why were you deporting dangerous criminals, as the Trump administration would have it, to El Salvador when you've just cleaned up the country and made it safer. So there really was a lot of mixed opinion when you talk to people on the streets about this. I mean, everyone had an opinion on it. That was kind of interesting, but it was very, very mixed.
You're based in Mexico City. You travel around the region. What's your latest view on, how others around the region see Bukele, to what extent they'd be willing to imitate his policies at a time when, organized crime continues to show up in country after country, and Latin America is the number one issue in polls?
I mean, I think he continues to be a reference point, right? People continue to look at El Salvador and learn lessons from him, not only on security and potentially how to crack down on crime, but also in terms of popularity and are trying to learn his tricks. I'm not sure any other leader has managed to do so successfully, or that any other country really has the conditions that El Salvador had to be able to do what Bukele has done. I mean, again, this is something that I think will be interesting to see, is whether the sheen, the sort of popularity with leaders continues to be the same, or whether if Bukele continues to lock up critics, whether that dims the view that other leaders in the region have of him. I mean, that's something, again, I think we have to wait and see what happens to his image, what happens to his popularity. And that partly depends on what he decides to do in El Salvador over the coming weeks.
Well, so that's, as we near the end here, that's my final question, is trying to look ahead a little bit. I remember speaking to a diplomat from another country, third country, early on in the Bukele years when he was starting to have success on the security front. The diplomat was broadly, impressed by what was happening on security, but said, the real problem here is that, Bukele is still going to be leader of this country 10 years from now. And what this obviously implied was suspension of the rules in the Salvadoran constitution that forbid re-election, which we've already seen, and the creeping takeover of other institutions as well. And usually, not always, but usually those stories don't end well for the countries where these things happen. What's your view? I mean, where do you think this is likely to go over the next year or 5 years?
I think we're at a turning point, which is a horrible cliched phrase that we're never allowed to write in the Economist, where we'll see whether he wants to get his popularity back and can do, and again, doesn't, start locking up anyone who says anything against him, or whether we continue down this path of locking up more and more people. So Ruth López, her arrest seemed a turning point. And then obviously several days later, we had Enrique Anaya. So I think at the moment, it looks very much like we're heading in one direction. And it's very clear that Bukele has amassed all sorts of powers. You can't ignore this. And while some of those powers might have been justified, or at least on the face of it justifiable for the security crackdown, many others aren't and no longer are. Lots of people say, why is the state of emergency still in force now, 3 years later, when the country is safer? The only reason they think so is so that Bukele can use these powers in whichever way he likes. So I think we are probably looking at a case of Bukele having amassed these powers and now turning them on the population. I hope I'm proved wrong, but I suspect that's the way we're headed at the moment.
Sarah, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.